You know, when I left Washington about 2 weeks ago to come here, the last headline I read was trade bill voted down, Obama legacy in shambles, presidency on the decline. We don't get many papers here, so has anything happened since then?
A little bit of exaggeration back then, don't you think? Yes, it's been a very big couple of weeks.
You know, what's transformative is the reaction to Charleston. I know we've had the trade bill, we've had the marriage equality decision, we've had the Affordable Care Act, but let's start with Charleston because I actually think it's a historical inflection point on race, on violence, on guns, on so many things. As a historian, why don't you walk me through what happened? How did you hear about it? How did the president hear about it? And how did he come to make that speech?
Sure. Well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. It's just a pleasure for me to be back here again, and thank you, Walter, for your creation of this extraordinary venue and for giving me this platform to have a conversation with you all. So 2 weeks ago tonight at approximately 8:37, I think exactly 8:37, I was copied on an email from Lisa Monaco in the White House to the president informing him that there had been this atrocious mass murder. And at that point, we were aware that 8 people had perished. We weren't sure about the 9th. And then in the hours that followed, of course, we all grew to learn that after participating in over an hour Bible study class, a stranger who had been welcomed into the Emmanuel AME Church took his gun out and shot after repeatedly reloading and murdered 9 people. He left one person alive who I met when we went down for the service displayed in the photograph. And he told her, "I'm leaving you alive so that you'll tell the story about why I did this, which is to try to attempt a racial war in this country. And I want to do this despicable act to make people angry." And of course, what followed soon after that, the young man was captured and he was arraigned. And in a moment I'll never forget listening to the sounds of the people, the family members whose loved ones had just been brutally murdered in a church, offer their forgiveness. And I think that spirit of our country says a lot about who we are. And of course, I believe that if we make the most of this opportunity of the spotlight on what was a catastrophically devastating crime, some good could follow. Because the spirit and the actions that we saw that followed that act of generosity have galvanized our country in, I think, what could be a moment. And of course, the future is yet to be written, but the president's message when he spoke down in Charleston was one of, let's be honest with one another, let's recognize our nation's history and some of the simmering anger that still exists, but realize that we have a choice, that we could do something different.
How did he decide to go to Charleston to make that speech? I mean, he was pretty exhausted, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was pretty tired, a lot going on, but I think as the days unfolded, it became clear that the nation was so focused on this issue, and at times like this, I think the nation needs to hear from its president. I think a big part of his frustration that you heard in the first time he addressed the press right after this incident, and I think it was mistaken as his willingness to think that there was nothing we could do, almost a resignation, and that wasn't it at all. It was just, he is so tired of having to speak at these tragic events, whether it's in Aurora or Newtown or Chicago or Philadelphia, where all around our nation, we lose 30 people a day to gun violence. And he thought that after Newtown, which was his single worst day as president, that there was a real galvanization of an effort to just do something sensible about gun violence. And so he was frustrated that there was so little he could do, and so he called on the American people to respond. And I think we have seen all across this country an outpouring of response.
Did he know he was going to sing? When did you find out?
So there's a little history about the president and singing. The first time he sang, those of you might remember, he came out and he sang a little Al Green, and it went over amazingly. I think people didn't know he had such a good voice. Well, I will confess to you that I was the voice backstage when he was being egged on by the electrical engineers who were doing the sound work for the show. Go on, Mr. President, sing, sing. And I said, don't sing, please, whatever you do, don't sing. And of course he sang, and it went over very well. So as we were on our way in the helicopter to Andrews the morning of the service, we were talking about the speech, and the First Lady hadn't read the speech yet, and so he said, and when I get to the second part of referring to Amazing Grace, I think I might sing. And he looked at me like, don't sing, because you saw what happened last time you said that. And so I said, and so the First Lady said, why on earth would that fit in? And so he started to explain, and he said, I don't know whether I'm going to do it, but I just wanted to warn you two that I might sing. And he said, we'll see how it feels at the time. And from the first time he started to speak, the church was clearly with him, and there was a lot of, yeah, you take your time, Mr. President, and yeah, that's right, and slow down, and I feel you, and all the things that you get in a black church. And so he knew they were with him, and so those of you who watched it, you probably saw that he paused for a minute right before he sang. So later I said to him, were you thinking about whether or not to sing? He said, oh no, I knew I was going to sing. I was just trying to figure out which key to sing in.
And they joined in right away.
And he said, and I think, and he said this on the helicopter, I think if I sing, the church will sing with me. And I think it was a powerful moment that I will never forget, particularly if you listen to the words of the song.
Right. The whole notion of Amazing Grace that came out of the families forgiving, too.
Yes.
It helped us begin a conversation about symbols of hatred, such as the Confederate battle flag and other things. Is that just a symbolic thing, or are we going to be able to take that type of discussion deeper?
Well, that's the question, and that was part of the message of his remarks. I mean, the Confederate flag is a terrible, terrible symbol that is deeply offensive, not just to African Americans, but to many people who understand its history. And yet for so many people, they thought it was benign and its existence in communities wasn't doing any harm. And I think what was clear, and I give Governor Nikki Haley a lot of credit for standing up so quickly with a great group of bipartisan people at her side saying, we're going to take this down, not thinking that that was the ends, as though that was the only offenses that this young man had Confederate flags on his person, but simply that symbolism is important. Symbolism counts, but the question is, what do you do beyond the symbolism? And that day the president also said, you know, we have to do something about our schools so that all of our young people have an equal opportunity to succeed. We need to make sure that health care is available in our country. We need to make sure that jobs are available and that we're not discriminating against people because of biases. So the person named John gets a better chance at a job than a person named Jamal. And so I think the whole message was, what do you do going beyond symbolism? And as you and I discussed, Walter, earlier, I guess the question is on all of us. You know, do you let this moment pass in the wave of a news cycle, or do we all collectively decide that we're going to be willing to have an honest look, not just at our history, but what kind of a future we want to have? You know, what are our values? What is our mutual obligation to one another? What kind of a society do we want to be known as? The people all over the world look to the United States to lead, and we have a great opportunity here to make the people who's lost their lives that day give it some real purpose and meaning. And when we met with the families afterwards, each family had something that they wanted to do to give back to the community. One family was making T-shirts that said, hate doesn't win, and another family wanted to start a day camp for disadvantaged children. They're all thinking about the future and what to do to honor their loved ones. If they can do it, my goodness, can't we do that too?
Wasn't there the one who survived who's had somebody working at the prison, right?
Yeah, so the woman who the young man spoke to and said, I want you to live to tell the story, the president, first lady, Dr. Biden, and the vice president all met with her, along with the other families of the victims, and she described what that was like. And the president's advice to her was, you know, make sure you're taking care of yourself, because he said he had met with a lot of people who've come back from war, and the survivor's guilt can be a powerful thing. And so he said, while you're tending to the loved ones who lost their loved ones, who were your your parishioners, your fellow parishioners, don't ignore your own health as well. And she said, you know, Mr. President, I used to work in the prison where that young man is now housed. And my friends still work there, and they're telling me that he's just so in tears and remorseful. And she said, in your prayers, Mr. President, remember him too. Amazing grace.
Some of us feel that there was an opportunity throughout this presidency to really deal passionately, vocally, and without putting a muffled hand in front of the face on the issue of race. And the president only did it halfway. He was always holding back on that. You got 16 months. Is this going to be the passion of the final stretch?
I think you have to ask yourself, why is that all on him? Why is that his responsibility? I think that each of us should be willing to have that conversation. And I think where he has thought it would be helpful, I mean, he gave an amazing speech about race in the midst of a hotly contested primary race that was deeply personal and open. He talked about race after Trayvon Martin's death, where he said that if I had a son, he would look like that. My brother's keeper grew out of the Zimmerman verdict, where the president said we all have to do some soul searching to figure out how are we treating one another. Last summer after Ferguson, he spoke very powerfully and then created a task force to focus on forging closer relationships between police departments and the communities that they serve and protect, particularly communities of color that have experienced disparate treatment over the years. So I think he's done a fair amount of talking. The question is, what are we going to do? What are we all going to do? And let's take the burden off of him solely, and because it is a collective responsibility. This is not something that the president can say suddenly because the country elected him president, that suddenly all of our history just evaporates. It doesn't. This has to happen family by family. It has to happen at the water cooler. That young man did not create that terrible act of violence in a vacuum. He was raised, he was in a community, he was part of a society, and I think understanding our inextricable link and obligation to each other is something that America has always been good at, and it's true to our values. And so I say the challenge and the burden is not solely on him, it's on all of us. And can we make a lot of progress in these next 18 months? Yes, we can. But we saw what some ordinary citizens could do through an act of goodness and amazing grace and forgiveness. So just imagine what the rest of us could do. Imagine if everyone in this room decided to leave this Ideas Festival and go back to your community and figure out what you're going to do to create that more perfect union.
Thank you. And part of that, beyond the discussion of race, deals with what you referred to as My Brother's Keeper initiative. You do the Women and Girls initiative too. What very specific policies and how can people get involved to make sure that people of all colors, all races, all backgrounds have an opportunity in a society where equal opportunity seems to be getting less, not better?
Well, thank you for that. Walter serves on the board of the My Brother's Keeper Alliance and has been extraordinarily supportive of this effort. And the goal is this. The goal is to say, what are we going to do to make sure that our boys and young men of color grow up and have a fair shot if they're prepared to work hard? What can we do to level the playing field? And right now, by every single metric, whether it's quality early childhood education, whether they're reading by 3rd grade, which is an indicator as to whether you'll graduate from college on time, or high school on time, whether they're finishing high school, whether they're going to college, whether they're getting expelled or suspended from school, whether they are in the juvenile justice system, which leads right to the adult penal system. By every single metric, boys and young men of color are lagging. And so the president said, what can we do to level that playing field and make sure that every child that is born with that twinkle in their eye has an opportunity to achieve their dreams. So Broderick Johnson, who I think is here, is chairing the effort in the White House, and Joe Echeverria, the former CEO of Deloitte, is chairing the My Brother's Keeper Alliance. And what we're doing, this is not a new big government program, quite the opposite. What we're looking to do is see how the government can help streamline all of the different ways that we impact the lives of boys and men of color, but that we really put a spotlight on programs that are currently working and that are changing the trajectory of these young lives. And so, what is the research that's out there that shows what we can do in early childhood education? We know every dollar we spend on early childhood education saves us $7 down the line. So what can we do to make sure everybody gets that education? We know we need to learn to read by 3rd grade. We are expelling and suspending too many of our young children. And we know that if you get a high school graduation and go on to college, your chance for being economically independent and successful are greatly enhanced. So we're looking at all across the country what's working. We have over, I think it is 240 communities and counting, where the mayors and county officials have stepped up and are coming up with community plans that embody what they're going to do to help these young people. And everyone in this room can do it. You can do a mentorship. You can find that program in your community that's working and help support it. You can volunteer in your local school. You can do all kinds of creative things to help support improving this trajectory. And so thank you, Walter, again for your leadership. And I know we're going to have a session. We had a session earlier today, and we're going to deal with it a little bit tomorrow. And we just encourage everybody to get together, because remember, those young boys and men are a part of our economy going forward. Right now, and this is just a kind of a telling statistic, since 1980, we have increased our prison population in the United States ninefold. Ninefold. We are 5% of the world population, yet we house 25% of the prison population. We cannot continue on that trajectory. That is, just imagine what we could do with those resources. Nearly a third of the Justice Department's budget goes to the federal penal system. What if we were pouring that money into helping with community policing? What if we were funding early childhood education? What if we were making college more affordable? There's just so much more we can do, not to mention, the New York Times had an extraordinary piece on this a few months ago about this, 1.5 million men who are just invisible. They are either dead, or they are in prison, or they are just not active, healthy participants in our society. We need to get them back, and this is a really good way to do that.
You've been talking, I think, to the Koch brothers' general counsel on the incarceration issue. I think we'll have Paul Ryan soon up on this stage talking about opportunity, how to create opportunity in our society. This seems to be something that does not need to be as polarized as it has been for the past few years. Do you think the last year gives us the opportunity to start transcending the polarization on these issues?
I absolutely do. And I will tell you, I attended a meeting a few months ago. It was a bipartisan meeting, both House and Senate, leaders who are sponsoring legislation on criminal justice reform. And we have some very unusual bedfellows in this. So it's everything from Koch Industries to Cory Booker. So you've just got a great cross-section of the country that realizes that this is just unacceptable. And it's not just an economic argument. Many of the faith leaders are concerned about what does this say about destroying the family. If you have so many, particularly men, locked up in prison, then they're not taking care of their family obligations. And what is the effect of that on children? And if your parents are in prison, the chances of you going to prison obviously is greatly increased as well. And so I think people are coming at this from a variety of different perspectives, but recognizing that we have to change this. And so I am optimistic that we could get some serious reform through Congress. Yes, I said it. I think we can get a bill passed on criminal justice reform. But again, it's going to take the American people getting engaged and saying that this is a priority, because there's only so much time, and they tend to only do like one thing at a time. But regardless of where you come down on the trade issue, it was a good example of the president's willingness to work with a wide range of people to do what he thinks is best for our country. And he believes that criminal justice reform, the time is now, and we can't afford to wait.
The tougher, almost intractable, you could see it in his face as he sighed when he talked about it. is guns. Is there any chance out of Charleston that there's going to be some change in the mindset in this country that will allow gun legislation?
Well, here's another statistic, and I think the president tweeted about this a couple of weeks ago. We have deaths from gun violence at a rate of 297 times that which is in Japan, 49 times that which is in France, and 33 times that which is in Israel. So we do not have a corner on mental illness in the United States. And so the question is, why are we having so many disproportionate number of people dying, as I said earlier, 30 a day from gun violence? And what are we going to do about it? And we really thought after Newtown, when every poll you looked at showed that the American people, 90+%, thought that we needed just some sensible background checks, because why would you want guns to fall into the hands of the wrong people? Nobody's arguing that we shouldn't have a very strong Second Amendment. But even for those who carry guns, you don't want them falling into the wrong hands. But when we were unable to get legislation through that day, it was really extraordinarily dispiriting, and we were there with the families from Newtown, and to look into the eyes of people who'd lost their 6-year-old children and try to explain how Congress could be so disconnected from their concerns and those of the American people was really frustrating. So what the president said after the Charleston horrible incident was, it's really on the American people. You've got to let your voices be heard. If you think that something should be done, and there are people like Gabby Gifford and Mark Kelly who are going state by state and helping support legislation at the state level, and that's having an impact. And if you think the federal government should do something, it's not going to happen without you getting involved and saying something.